Hello, this is Robert Rickover. I'm an Alexander Technique teacher in Omaha, Nebraska, and my guest is Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher in Wilmington, Delaware. I think both of us teach primarily online these days, and we've been having a number of discussions about what I guess you could call the interface between thinking and doing, or thinking using a direction and how to make that direction the most effective possible, or perhaps we could frame it as using inhibition and making that as effective as possible. And I want to veer into what might be perhaps a little more controversial area than we've been doing so far. And it's basically the question, one of the things that when people talk about the benefits of the Alexander technique, there's often an idea here that what's really going to be good is you're going to start to you'll notice things more, you'll be more aware. Self-awareness is one of those things that's kind of part of what often people are told they will get from taking lessons, right? Does that sound reasonable to
It
you?
sounds reasonable and it seems to be
And
true in my
I think it
experience.
is true. But I think there's a little confusion about this business of self-awareness, and I want to explain where I'm coming from with this. And I want to also say this is the first take, and there might be very well be some people might have some ideas that would cause both of us to change our minds about certain things. But it's the question I guess the basic question I have is it necessary or even desirable to sense where you're holding tension if you are in the process of using an Alexander technique direction to improve your situation? Is it important that you know what it is you're hoping to improve, perhaps might be another way of putting it? As
So,
opposed to thinking, well, there's every chance that there are things I'm doing that are not useful, that are not optimal. I don't necessarily know what they are, but I would like to make it more optimal. But I don't necessarily know what they are.
um, so I don't think you need to know what exactly is. I think what you sent me ahead of time was like where you're holding tension,
Yeah.
um, or what the cause is, or any of that,
Mhm.
to be able um, to give a self direction, to do some constructive thinking that could potentially help you release that. Um, um, I do think so. You're talking about in the moment, so I don't think it's necessary in the moment. I, I do think over time there is a usefulness to becoming more aware of when you become more tense or in less good use to use Alexander terminology. Not that it's probably useful in that moment to directly try and direct your arm to do something different, but
Mhm.
more that, okay, so I've recognized there's something going on here. Let me use a direction that I've known in the past has been generally helpful and see what happens. And
Yeah.
that's different from trying to directly fix that you noticed your shoulder was up like this. Of course, you could
Yeah,
just let go of your shoulder.
that's pretty much
So,
what I have in mind. And
I do want to say something else,
yeah.
though.
Oh, sure.
That there could be, especially along your kind of journey of study, be some useful things to learn along the way about how your arm or your hand functions, or but not that you're going to use that to directly direct the place. In my opinion, that's generally, it's more like that you've got this now background knowledge of how it can optimally function and how it's designed to move, for instance.
Mhm.
And you know, for instance, knowing where my sit bones are is a
Mhm.
useful thing.
And where the top of your spine is,
Yes,
very
yeah.
useful thing. Yeah,
But if
absolutely.
I start thinking, oh, I've got to put this sit bone here, and
Yeah,
it's a little bit different. I'm not. I'm not. I am. I do. I notice I'm on them, but I'm not really directing into them, or however some people talk about that.
right, right.
Yeah.
Well, so what
Uh,
my take on this is pretty much very similar to yours, but I would think in terms of the self-awareness aspect, uh, is it best that we think of self-awareness is something you intend to do in order, or to have that awareness in order to make a useful change? Which I think I might have argued that in the past, that that's the
well, I mean,
case.
it can be a prompt to
It can be
remind
a
you to
prompt.
do
Hmm.
your inhibition and your direction, right?
Right.
Um, but you could do that without a prompt if you're, you know.
I think it's well, so the question to me is self-awareness something to bring to bear in order to make things better for you? Or that um is it something that emerges out of using directions and inhibition and direction in a more general way without any reference to a particular part of you? In other words, does it come out of that and
Well, I
perhaps
think it
out
could
of
really
body
be.
mapping, that kind of thing?
I think it could be both. Yes, to
Or
in
also,
different situations. Yeah.
if let's say your current big issue is neck tension, which I
Mhm,
would be true of a lot of new students, um, if they're starting to experiment with directions, and the kind of classic issue that comes up, one of them is, well, how do I remember to even do that? And if you're following that path and you're going for a walk or lifting something or doing something, you notice that old familiar tension in your neck creeping
mhm,
in. That can serve as a great signal to
mhm,
bring back a direction that may have
mhm.
nothing specifically to do with your neck. Could be just,
Absolutely,
I'm
and
free, or, I'm not compressing myself. Those sorts of directions.
and I don't think I'm unique in that, for me, a neck tension was my main
There,
issue, not
uh-huh.
just a subordinate issue, my
It was
main
it.
thing.
Yeah,
I say was, it still can be, but in a very different way from when I first started lessons.
right.
Um, but for really, for the most part, if not 100%, trying to direct specifically around this area was completely counterproductive. It was more global
Mhm.
directions, or maybe in the beginning, directing a very different toward a very different part of my body. But it was, I would get in real trouble when I tried to direct my neck to be free, or even to not to tense my neck. Even a negative direction was not helpful to me for that specific area because it was too much of a trigger and a habit for me. And global
Right.
directions were
And
really helpful.
and I think the argument I'm wanting to make, at least tentatively, is having a specific piece of tension in mind when you're self-directing carries with it a great danger, which is that you're going to be in the moment kind of interested in what happens to that pain or discomfort
And
issue.
of course, if that's a really area of concern, great concern for you, it'd be really hard not to use that as even a sort of barometer of how you're doing,
Exactly.
and that can be really tricky.
Because it takes you away from the direction.
Yeah.
That's the problem. It's if you're really focused, if you're really interested in what's going on with your neck, and that's why you're even taking Alexander lessons in the first place. And so you're using a self-direction, even if it's not a self-direction that's specifically pointing to the neck, even if it's a more general one, there's a part of you that's very likely to be, wow, what's going on with my neck? I just want to check in briefly. I know I'm not supposed to do anything, but that checking in is a kind of a doing.
It is, and it's something I've had to work with a lot because my habit was to be constantly checking my neck before Alexander and after I started Alexander,
Right.
to see, and there's tension in the checking, let's put it like that, which is,
Right. Right.
yeah.
And so that's kind of my basic point. I'm not sure. I I think it's a little unclear when you read teachers' descriptions of the Alexander technique and how it can help you and so on, like going on their website and just seeing what teachers say about it. There seems like there's often an implication that we're going to help you become more self-aware so that you can better able to improve things. And I think that's a little tricky. In principle, it sounds great, but I think in practice, until someone's become really good at thinking using self-directions with absolutely no doing attached to them of any kind, including just checking in, how's it working, during experiments that you do, that danger kind of outweighs the whatever advantages of the specific self-awareness that you might want to cultivate. I think you'll get that self-awareness for
But I think
sure.
that statement is true.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see what you're saying about it can be a pitfall if people try to do what the statement is
And
saying. Yeah.
we've had other talks, and I've quoted all the great teachers, the FM, of course, and then pretty much all the second generation teachers specifically address this. I think the strongest version of it comes from Marjorie Barlow, Alexander's niece, and she addresses it very forcefully in her book. Can't think.
Oh,
Uh,
an unexa an
Examined
unexamined life,
life.
an examined life,
Examined
not
life,
an
yeah,
yeah.
where she uses she says, well, the temptation to just help out a little bit, you think, just a little bit's not going to hurt things, and she says, nope, not even a teeny weeny bit. Those are her words. You want to strive for just put out the direction, just the thought. Stuff may happen. You may sort of notice it out of the corner of your mind, but you don't want to get drawn into it.
Yeah,
It's a dead end. It's a dead end. And I've heard all kinds of teachers describe this in different ways. Bill Conable, who's like the sort of, I guess, the father, co-parent of
body mapping.
body mapping. I remember him once saying he was working with a student in a group and they were suddenly noticing a nice, useful change. And he said, now this is a dangerous moment, very dangerous moment, because, oh, this is something that I've been concerned about has improved. And it's really hard for me to not get sucked into focusing on that. Wow, look at that. My ankles are free now and they weren't before, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So
I think the other side of it is that I've seen some things written to the effect that, when you notice that something is happening, then you know how to inhibit that and direct that, direct in a way. So we already addressed that, but I don't think you need to know. Sometimes we just know something's a bit off, but I don't know exactly where that is. Right? We can tell that we're not as at ease as we would wish. We're not in as good use as we would wish, but there's nothing specifically that's coming to our attention. And I think in a way that's easier to deal with because you don't get sucked into, but you absolutely don't need to know the specifics to be able to help yourself in the moment.
And sometimes, I mean, there's some specific examples where it can really pay not to get feedback from your direction. So for example, I've a direction that can be very helpful to a lot of people is something like, I'm not breathing, or my breathing is free, or that sort of thing. And if you're just sitting quietly or lying down, often your breathing will make a fairly dramatic change that you'll notice, and then you have this problem we're talking about. So for students like that, I sometimes suggest try that, using that direction when you're in a more in an actual activity where parts of your body are moving, like walking or running or climbing.
So there's
stairs,
other things that you're paying attention to,
that
not
are
just
going to swamp the other, and use that direction. My breathing is free in a situation where you're not likely, although some people they're good at doing that even in those, but for I'd say most students, if they're using a direction like I'm free, my breathing's free when they're walking or running or doing a more rigorous activity, they will notice other things happening, perhaps when they think about their breathing, but they're not necessarily noticing the dramatic change that's happening in their breathing, because it's swamped by arm and leg movements and heart beating faster and all the rest of it. So there's a specific time when it's actually advantageous to have your student experiment in a situation where they're not going to sense the direct result of what they're
that's interesting. So that's not in a really kind of quiet situation, if you like.
Quiet situation, even a small change in your breathing, it can seem fairly momentous, whereas if you're in the middle of a run or climbing some stairs, it's quite possible you won't even notice it. And that would be a highly desirable thing from an experimental point of view, because it would keep you from circumventing the power of the direction itself.
So just, me,
I
to be
know,
devil's advocate.
always.
The danger could be that, oh, I didn't notice anything working, I'm not going to use that again.
Well, maybe against the background of having explored it when they're lying down and all, but also
Yeah,
generally
with
what
some,
happens is
yeah,
they'll notice something else, like their running will be a little easier, their footfalls
yeah.
will be a little less heavy. It
So I
doesn't
think that's with
seem to
all,
have anything to do
with,
any obvious connection with breathing. So they're less likely, since they're thinking about breathing and they're noticing something else, it's easier to let go of that noticing, because it doesn't, that, like, you know, it's interesting. It does tell them that this direction's useful beyond just breathing, because after all, everything is connected with everything else, and literally. So it's just a way around that problem. But I think the ultimate way around it could be having no idea of what it is you're about to change.
well,
Uh,
I think that would be what I would like to be behind on everyone's um, giving of a direction. It's just like this wondering, I wonder what will happen when I give this direction, even if it seems like a direction that's specific to an area, like the breathing one.
mhm,
But still, like, I'm just wondering what happens in general. And also that you don't have to notice anything.
mhm.
Um, and anything you do notice is sort of from afar. You mentioned earlier that it's kind of like at the corner of your eye, that you just kind of,
Yeah,
I sometimes just look, I'm just having this very mild light interest, as if it's something very far away from you that's happening or
right. And
something
we
like
have to distinguish between what's going on when you're running an experiment with yourself to test the direction. So you use it and then you throw it away, or you replace it with a nonsense thought. And a lot, I'd say the majority, not everybody, but the majority of students can play with that right away and notice a
that.
difference.
Mm-hmm.
So there they are noticing things, but only as a way to gain some confidence in the usefulness of the direction. But
Right.
once
Mm-hmm.
they've got that confidence, then the direction is something that they could and probably would be desirable for them to use during the day at random times, and maybe less than random times, because they may notice some old patterns kicking in, some tightening or pain or discomfort, which could serve as a reminder, oh, maybe time to renew those basic directions that don't necessarily have anything to do with the specific thing you're
No,
noticing.
but you have, like you say, like this confidence that this has been a useful
Yeah,
thing in the past. And it's this the idea of just kind of thinking it and letting it go out
roll it
there, and
out.
that you don't
Yeah.
have to make anything. We've talked all about that before. We don't have to
Right.
make
That's pretty standard
any. Yeah.
Alexander, I guess pedagogy, maybe. And
Hmm.
just and one another quote that we talked about earlier, where Alexander is being interviewed by one of the teachers on his first trainees on his first training course, George Trevelyan, and he says he laments the fact, he says, none of my students will believe that all they have to do is think the thought and that will do the trick.
Yeah.
And he's kind of saying that too.
Yeah.
And all of the, we have quotes from Walter. Everybody pretty much has addressed this issue, because I think it's a major issue in
Hmm.
learning how to effectively how to really have constructive conscious control, which is what hopefully we're teaching people, and
Hmm.
people are learning. Oh, that's all I
Indeed.
got to say. You have anything else you want to add to
I
this?
think we've
Covered it.
covered all the things that maybe we want to say about this particular topic so far.
So far.
So,
Yeah, and
yeah.
I really like to hear from anyone who has a different take on this, because maybe something we're missing here. But to me, the
Absolutely.
more I experiment, the less important it is to have that sort of traditional self-awareness while I'm directing. No, I just direct, and that's all I need to do. And to put energy into noticing when I haven't already happened and it hasn't already jumped out at me, that's effort. That's doing. Yeah.
Yeah, we said we'd finish, but
Yeah.
I often think about, like, I don't have to go looking for things. It's like I can trust that if something needs my attention, I'm going to notice it.
Right. And if a student gets to the point where they are perfect, let's say, no extra anything, then what will happen when they self-direct in this way will be nothing will happen. Certainly nothing bad will happen. Nothing will happen. And maybe.
Have you ever met such a student?
I have never. I've met a couple. I've had a few students that were pretty close to that, but never anyone who was like 100% there. I mean, Alexander was asked once, well, there's come a point when you don't have to self-direct anymore. And he gave one of his typical Alexander type answers, which was, yes, that point will come. But when it comes, you won't want to not direct. And
Yeah.
that's a whole, what do you mean by that? And I think there's some pretty good answers to that question. Yeah. Anyway, well,
yes.
let's end the conversation here. My guest has been Imogen Ragone, an Alexander teacher in Wilmington, Delaware, and I'll put a link to her site by the interview and a link where you can get more information about the Alexander technique. And I think I'll also put a link to some material on self-directing. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.